with the month of Nisan already moving on, something for the Leil HaSeder. Of course, the central mitzvah is we got it to Lebincha, Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. What I'd like to do now is study with you the Rambam at the beginning of Perek Zayin Mehilchas Chametz UMatzah. So I don't know if you have access to the Rambam. I have a Rambam right here. I'm going to bring it. Mitzvahs HaSeder shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'niflos shenasu lavosenu b'Mitzrayim b'leil chamishasar. Now, there's a sentence here in the Rambam that we don't know exactly how to read the Rambam. I'm going to offer two possibilities.
Could you please repeat the location?
Yeah, Perek Zayin, Mehilchas Chametz UMatzah. We're going to learn Halacha Aleph, Halacha Beis, Halacha Gimel, Emir Hashem.
Thank you.
So one way of reading the Rambam is the following. Mitzvahs HaSeder shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'niflos shenasu lavosenu b'Mitzrayim, period. B'leil chamishasar b'Nisan. If I put the period in, then the words B'leil chamishasar b'Nisan are there to identify the Zman HaMitzvah. When do you have a mitzvah HaSeder shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'niflo shenasu lavosenu b'Mitzrayim? The Rambam answers B'leil chamishasar b'Nisan. But there's another way of reading the Rambam. Alternatively, mitzvahs HaSeder shel Torah l'saper b'nisim v'niflos. Which nisim v'niflos? Shenasu lavosenu b'Mitzrayim b'leil chamishasar. We are commanded to describe the miracles that our forefathers experienced on the night of the 15th, meaning these are the miracles that we have to speak about, the miracles of the night of the 15th. Now, we know that there were Eser Makos, and only the last of the 10 Makas Bechoros took place on the night of the 15th of Nisan, the night of the Geula, the Yetziah Mitzrayim. In the second way, the second alternative reading of the Rambam, the mitzvah of Sipur is limited only to the last of the 10 Makas. And what's fascinating is that at the end of Hilchas Chametz UMatzah, the Rambam has the Nusach HaGodah. And guess what's missing in the Rambam's Nusach HaGodah? It's like an abridged Nusach HaGodah. It's like a, whatever, anyway. Nothing about the Eser Makas. I mean, that's like half of the Haggadah almost, is completely omitted from the Rambam. There's no Ditzach Hadash V'Achaz, there's no, pouring out the wine from the cups. All that is missing in the Rambam. And the reason is, if we accept the second reading of the Rambam, that the mitzvah Sipur is limited to those miracles that took place on the night of the 15th, not the miracles that took place before that. The Rambam goes on, and he says, "Shenemar zocher es hayom hazeh sheyitzosim Mitzrayim." So the Rambam is very careful. He does not identify the source of the mitzvah of Sipur as V'yigadet lebincha. We'll see later on in the Rambam, he brings in that pasuk V'yigadet lebincha, but the source in the Torah, the Shenemar, is Zachar Sayom Hazeh Asher Yatzasi Mitzrayim. Now, what's fascinating about that is that we have what's called Sheish Zechiros. There are 6 episodes in Jewish history which we require Zechira. And the Sifra, which we'll get a chance later, maybe we'll see it inside, says that the word Zachar means Shetehei Shone Beficha Halachos. So I'll give you one example. It says Zachar Eis Asher Asa LeMiriam. Now Miriam's sin, as we all know, at the end of Parshas Baloscha, was the sin of Lashon Hara. And the Sifra says that we fulfill the mitzvah of remembering Miriam by learning the laws of Lashon Hara. For example, it says Zachar Eis Asher Asa Amalek, and according to the Sifra, we fulfill that mitzvah by learning the halachos of Amalek, whatever halachos apply to Amalek, whether it's Mechia, whether it's Zechira. And this goes on and on. Now, in the case of the Rambam, who derives the halacha and the mitzvah of Sipur on the night of the 15th from Zachar, the conclusion to be drawn is that on the night of the 15th, we are commanded to learn the laws of Pesach. And if you take a look in the Haggadah, in the section of the Arba Banim, when it comes to the Ben HaChacham, it says, Af Amar, he asks about the Avoda, Af Amar lo kehilchas HaPesach. Ein maftir nachar Pesach hafikoman. But there are those who have a different text in the Haggadah, according to which it says, Ad ein maftir nachar Pesach hafikoman. That extra word of 2 letters, ad, changes the whole meaning. Because what it says is that Ein Maftir Nachar Pesach Avikom, which is at the very end of Masechta Psachim, you should be teaching the Chacham everything in the Masechta until the end of the Masechta of Ein Maftir Nachar Pesach Avikom. And some commentaries say that when it says in the Haggadah that there were 5 Tanoim in Bnei Brak that was sitting on the night of Pesach, what were they doing throughout the night? According to some, they were learning the laws of Pesach. So it seems that there's a mitzvah to learn the laws of Pesach on Leil Chamishasar. If the Rambam is correct and we derive the mitzvah of Sipur from Zachar, then Zechira has to be Shetei Shona Beficha. You should be learning the halachas. So, for example, there are those who have a minhag of staying up late to read Shir Hashirim at the conclusion of the Haggadah. Kol HaKavod. I'm not trying to undermine any minhagim, but I would suggest, according to what we're saying now, to add to Shir Hashirim, or maybe to replace Shir Hashirim, instead we should be learning the halachas of Pesach. And we know how many volumes and volumes there are of Hilchas Pesach. It'll keep you busy throughout the night if you're not already asleep in the middle of the Seder. Now the Rambam adds an equation here. Kemoshe Nemar, Zachras Yom HaShabbos. Now you and I have been learning the laws of Kiddush and a little bit of Havdalah, which is derived from this pasuk that the Rambam quotes, Zachras Yom HaShabbos. But one would wonder, why does the Rambam feel compelled to add this analogy between the mitzvah of Zachar es hayom hazeh sheyotzaseh miMitzrayim and Zachar es yom haShabbos l'kadsho? I mean, true, both have the word Zachar, but why would the Rambam find it necessary? Why is he compelled to add that kimo shenemar? And there are various interpretations of the Rambam. My favorite is the following. I'm sure you've heard it. The Rambam is coming to answer a question which appears in the space between the last word miMitzrayim and the kimo shenemar. What's in that space? How do you know that the pasuk Zachar es hayom hazeh sheyotzaseh miMitzrayim obligates a mitzvah on the night of the 15th? Maybe this pasuk refers to the entire year. Hence, it becomes the source for the mitzvah of Zachiras Yetzias Mitzrayim L'Gans Yor, but it's not the special mitzvah of Leil Tesvav. And the Rambam derives from another pasuk that when it says Zachar es hayom hazeh sheyotzaseh Mitzrayim, it means on the day of Yetzias Mitzrayim, you're obligated in the mitzvah of Zachar on that day, which means the night of the 15th. How do we see that? Because it says Zachar es yom haShabbos l'kadsho. Maybe Zachar es yom haShabbos l'kadsho, and what I'm about to say, certainly the Shita Beit Shammai, would apply the beginning of the week. So on Sunday, I have a beautiful piece of a salmon steak, and I save it for Shabbos. How do I know that there's a mitzvah of Zachar to remember the Shabbos on Shabbos itself? And that's something that we learn in derivations from the word lekadsho, that we sanctify the Shabbos on Shabbos with this mitzvah of Zechira. So the Rambam is setting up a very beautiful equation now. Just like the Zachar of Shabbos means to remember Shabbos on Shabbos, so too the Zachar of Yom Tzeischah Mitzrayim is on the day of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And now the Rambam wants to go on and tell us that the mitzvah is B'layla. And the strange thing is that when we first read the pasuk that the Rambam invokes to prove that the mitzvah is B'layla, we don't see anything in the pasuk apparently indicating it's B'layla. He says, "Uminayin shebelel chamishasar." And by the way, the fact that the Rambam opens up minayin belel chamishasar would seem to indicate that in the opening line of this chapter, when the Rambam says belel chamishasar, he was describing the nisim and the niflos that were obligated to be mesaper. And those are the nisim and niflos that took place on the night of the 15th. But now the Rambam is asking a different question about the night of the 15th. How do we know that the mitzvah of Zachar applies only B'layla? After all, the pasuk that the Rambam quotes as the source for Sipur is Zachar hayom hazeh, so maybe the entire yom. Talmud Lomer v'yigadet lebincha. In the pasuk v'yigadet lebincha, it also says Bayom hahu. How do we know it's Laila? Because the end of the pasuk says Bavur zeh, and the Rambam quotes the famous drush of Chazal, which we repeat in the Haggadah. B'shosh yesh matzah u'morah munachim lefanecha. When is there a mitzvah of matzah u'morah? On the night of Tesvav, and therefore v'yigadet lebincha bavur zeh teaches me that we are supposed to be talking to our children on the night of Chamishasar b'Nisan. Now the Rambam says, "V'yafal pi she'ein lo ben." You should know, says the Rambam, that the mitzvah applies even if you don't have a son. V'afilu chachamim gedolim, and even great scholars. Chayovim l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim kol hamarich b'dvorim she'iru v'shahoyu harezem mishubach. Let's go on to halacha beis. Mitzvah lo dia lebanim, va'afilu lo sha'alu, shenemar, v'yigadeto lebincha. Now, I find this a little bit strange. The Rambam, as you know, is very sensitive to the sequence of halachos, what we call the HaSeder halachos. And now in halacha beis, the Rambam speaks about lo dia lebanim, which implies that the children are asking questions and you're notifying them, you're answering their questions. And the Rambam goes on to say, but the mitzvah does not depend upon the precondition is not that they ask the questions, but afilu lo sha'alu. Now that's a little bit strange. The Rambam already established in the previous halacha aleph, v'af al pi she'en lo ben. It would seem to me, again, lefi ani is daiti, that the Rambam switched around the order here. It would have been more logical for the Rambam to begin by presenting the mitzvah lo dia lebanim, that the mitzvah is to notify, to teach the children, and then afal pi shelo shalo, even if the children did not take the initiative by asking the questions, shenemar v'yigadeto lebincha. So v'yigadeto lebincha is not conditional on the question. The answer is crucial. And then I would have added, if I were the Rambam, v'afal pi she'en lo ben. So you've already told me that the mitzvah is to answer the questions of the son. Then you've told me that if the son doesn't ask the question, there still is a mitzvah. Now you should tell me that even if you don't have a son, there still is a mitzvah. But for some reason, the Rambam begins with afal pi she'en lo ben in halacha aleph, and then in halacha beis, he tells you exactly how to fulfill the mitzvah. Being modia leben, afal pi shelo shalo, shenemar v'yigadeto mincha. Now, I would at this point perhaps start a new halach in the Rambam. For some reason, the Rambam did not do so. Lefi daito shel ben aviv melamda. In other words, there's no single absolute way to teach the child, but rather it should be a relative way of teaching the son, not absolute. It's not standard. It's not uniform for every son. It's lefi daito shel ben. Ketzad im hoya katan. The child is young. Oh, tipe. She's very limited in his intellectual capacity. He's dull. Omer lo b'ni kulanu hayinu avadim k'mo shivcha zu. He illustrates it by pointing to a shivcha, o k'mo eved zeh b'mitzrayim. U'belayla zeh podo sonu HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'yotzienu l'cherus. V'im hoya ben gadol v'chacham. He's more mature, or he's intellectual, his capacity is a greater capacity. Modio, again the word modio, Mashe'iro lanu b'mitzrayim, okay, iro lanu Mitzrayim means the sequence of events, one after the other in Mitzrayim, probably going back to Havan Eschatmalo. V'nisim shenasu lanu al yidei Moshe Rabbeinu, interesting. The Rambam here mentions Moshe Rabbeinu. In the Haggadah,
He's not there.
Moshe's name is not mentioned. Hakol lefi daito shel ben. V'tzarech lasos shinui b'layla hazeh k'dei sheyiru abanim v'yishalu. So the ultimate goal, if we want to reach the ideal mitzvah, is to stimulate the curiosity of the children so that they will ask the questions. V'yomru ma nishtana layla hazeh mikol eilos. Interesting, the Rambam seems to have a pretty short, abbreviated form of the question of the child. And he asks, Ma nishtana alayla hazeh mikol eilos. Ad sheyoshev lev v'yomelem kach v'kach iru v'kach v'kach hoyu. The Rambam goes on to give us various examples of possible alternative methods of stimulating the curiosity of the child. Let me suggest, if I will, the Seder HaDvarim in the Rambam's first three halachos. What is the logical sequence of Aleph, Beis, and Gimel? First of all, in halach Aleph, the Rambam determines what the source of the mitzvah is. Zocher es hayom hazeh sheyitzasem Mitzrayim. When does this mitzvah apply? The Rambam goes on to establish, based on the pasuk v'yigadeta lebincha b'avor zeh, that it's on the night of the 15th. Again, in the middle, we had the equation to Shabbos. Now, the Rambam, in a sense, is bothered by the following question. Once we derive that the Zman mitzvah is based on the pasuk v'yigadeta lebincha, maybe the entire mitzvah is conditional on the fact that he has a ben. For example, the Torah says, "V'limadatem osam es b'nechem." In the mitzvah Talmud Torah, the father is a chiyuv to teach his son. Obviously, that's conditional on the fact that he has a son. And by analogy, v'yigadeta lebincha should be conditional on the fact that he has a son. So the Rambam says, no. You want to think that if he doesn't have a son, he's not chayav? No. This obligation is not contingent on the fact that he has a son. And even if he doesn't have a son, he's chayav. So the Rambam, when he says Aval Bishay Lo Ben, is trying to dispel a mistaken notion that one might have possibly entertained based on the fact that the Zman of this mitzvah is derived from V'yigadeta lebincha. And therefore one might have jumped the gun and thought that not only is the Zman mitzvah dependent upon V'yigadeta lebincha, but the Chiyuv ha-mitzvah is contingent upon V'yigadeta lebincha. And the Rambam comes lafuke. Now the Rambam wants to define the mitzvah. What is the mitzvah? So the Rambam emphasizes, Afilu kulanu chachamim gedolim chayovim l'sapeh. And this is a chunk of the Haggadah. Let's read, I have in front of me the Nusach of the Haggadah. Afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu nevonim, etc., kulanu yodim es haTorah, mitzvah leidu l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. So yesh lachkar. Let's offer two definitions of this mitzvah. And the answer is right here in the language of the Haggadah and the language of the Rambam. Is the mitzvah A, learning about the Nisim and Niflos, limud, or B, the mitzvah is l'saper b'Nisim and Niflos? Again, is it limud or sipur? And what does it say over here? Mitzvah aleinu l'saper. It doesn't say mitzvah aleinu lilmod. Now, what's the nafkamina between lilmod and l'saper? And the question is, chachamim gedolim skenim sheyodim es haTorah. If you're going to tell me the mitzvah is lilmod, lilmod means ladas, the purpose of learning is to acquire knowledge, well, yodim es haTorah. And therefore, there's no mitzvah of sipur. There's no point to review that which you know. But if the mitzvah is sipur, then speaking about the Nisim Neflos, even though you know them, you're an expert, you're a baki, you could be tested in every medrash and every insight of Chazal into Yetzias Mitzrayim. Nevertheless, there's still a separate, independent mitzvah of Sipur. And it's not learning for the sake of knowledge, but Sipur as an end unto itself. And therefore, even Chachamim Gedolim Sheyodim Es HaTorah, and they are experts that have acquired all the knowledge that you need, they are still chayav in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And perhaps the paradigm for this is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Now you may know, or maybe you don't know, that I've spent a lot of time of my life on the Rambam Hilchos Talmud Torah. It's one of my favorite pastimes. And Baruch Hashem, I hope to publish on this because I have a lot of written chidushim. But one of the issues that comes up in Talmud Torah is whether or not there's a mitzvah to learn that which you know. When we review, or when we're teaching others that which we already know, is that also included in the mitzvah Talmud Torah, or the mitzvah is Yediyas HaTorah? Not limud, but Yediyah. And if I already have the Yediyah, then there's no mitzvah. And I'd like to suggest that this question was actually a dialogue, or underlies the deeper meaning of the dialogue, between someone by the name of Ben Dama, that was his name, and his famous absolute giant uncle, Rabbi Shmuel. The Gemara tells us in Masechet Menachos on Daf Tzadi Tes, and I think I've mentioned it to you in the past, that Ben Dama approached his uncle with the following question. Kigona no, somebody like me, shalamadati es kol Torah kula. Pretty impressive. I've covered the entire gamut of Torah. Again, it may have been a little bit easier back at that time. You know, there was no Mishnah, there was no Tosefta, there was no Bavli, Yushalmi, Sifra, Sifri, Mechilta. It was a little bit easier. Ma'u lilmod chachma yivanis. Am I allowed to spend my time now studying Greek philosophy? And Rabbi Shmuel, according to the Gemara, Kara lavas hakasuv, v'gisa bo yomo v'layla. Tsei ubedok zman shu lo min hayom v'lo min halayla. Ulamod bo chachma yivanis. On the side, pay attention that Rabbi Shmuel was not opposed to the study of Greek philosophy per se, but just find time to do it. But it's got to be a time that's not night and not day, because what was Ben Dama thinking, and what was the Kamashmalan of Rabbi Shmuel, his uncle? Perhaps Ben Dama was of the opinion that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is a mitzvah of yediyah, what we call in modern Hebrew, lirchosh yediyah, to acquire knowledge. Well, says Ben Dama, Kigona no, shalamadati is kol Torah kula. For me, just reviewing what I know is not within the purview of Talmud Torah. I was basically yotzei my mitzvah of Talmud Torah. I achieved its goal, and Gandik. I can now go on and study Greek philosophy. One of my students in class is studying German. I tested him. He gave me a list of pages and pages of words in English with a translation into German. He gave me his list. He didn't have the list in front of him, and he scored 100. Every complicated word in English he knew in German, and he taught himself German. Anyway, so Ben Dama says, you know what? My favorite pastime, if I have the time, is to study Greek philosophy. I've already fulfilled my mitzvah of Talmud Torah because I know it all. Rabbi Shmuel says, no. The mitzvah is v'gisavo is to learn and learn and learn, review. Every minute that you learn Torah, there's a separate independent chiyuv of Talmud Torah, of learning Torah, not Yediyas HaTorah. Obviously, Yediyas HaTorah is a major part and a goal of Talmud Torah. Coming back now to the mitzvah Sipi Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Rambam, right here at the beginning of Hilchas, Perek Zayin Hilchas Chametz UMatzah, emphasizes that even Chachamim Gedolim are obligated in the mitzvah of Sipur. And the Rambam wants to emphasize that if we define the mitzvah of Sipur not as limud, but rather as Sipur per se, then the Rambam says even a Chacham Gadol, he knows it all. He can tell you about the Nisim and the Flows in his dreams, in his sleep. He's still obligated in Sipur. Sipur is itself an independent mitzvah. And then the Rambam asks himself, how far does this mitzvah go? At what point do I say, you know what? I read the Haggadah, I fulfilled the mitzvah, Shalom al Yisrael. No, says the Rambam. Kol hamarech l'saper. He should continue. There is no limit to this mitzvah. The kiyum mitzvah continues as long as he's being misaper. That, my friends, in my humble opinion, is a summary of Halacha Aleph. Now the Rambam in Halacha Beis goes on. I've already defined the mitzvah in Halacha Aleph. It's a mitzvah of Sipur. But, says the Rambam, you know what? How do you fulfill that mitzvah of Sipur? And the answer, says the Rambam, is lo dia leben. Vigada to lebinya means that it's a mitzvah that, although it's Sipur, but the framework of the mitzvah, the methodology of the mitzvah, is a methodology of limud, of vigada to lebincha lo dia leben. And therefore it's ideal if the ben's curiosity is aroused and you are responding to his questions. In the educational system, we know that an answer to a question is a lot more meaningful than just feeding a person knowledge without his curiosity. And therefore, the Rambam goes on to tell me that the mitzvah is not contingent on the son asking the question, because the mitzvah of limud and its methodology does not require a question. A question would be ideal, but if it doesn't come, there still remains a mitzvah to teach. And now the Rambam drops the bomb, and he says, you know what? If the method of Sipur is through limud and through Talmud and through teaching, and that's what Vigada to Bincha means, Higada is a lashon of teaching. Like, for example, in the Pasuk, in Shmos Perek Yud-Tes, it says, Ko tomar lebeis Yaakov v'tagid lebnei Yisrael. Tagid means teach bnei Yisrael. So the word Haggadah means to teach. Says the Rambam, the teaching has to fit the student. As we say, da b'fnei miat ha'omed. Know your students. Understand what level they're at, how you can teach them. And you can't teach two students and two sons the same way. One son is a little bit dull. He cannot grasp abstract concepts and principles. Teach him something that's what we call in Hebrew muchashi, something that he can sense. Audio visual. Like my son Menachem, I remember one Pesach night he had gathered together all these little toy animals, and he demonstrated the Yeser Makas. He dressed up as Paro, and he said, "No, I won't let you go," and everything else. Now, this is a fulfillment of Shlomo Melech's precept in Mishlei, Chanoch Linar al pi darko, and that is the yesod of Talmud Torah. Teaching Torah's al pi darko has to fit the person. Can't teach a katan or a tipesh the same way that you teach abstract concepts to a gadol and a chacham. Then the Rambam Halacha Gimel adds that since we've established that within the context of defining the mitzvah of Sipur as a method of teaching, the ideal is lohodia leben after the ben asks the question. Therefore, we are obligated to try and try again to stimulate the curiosity of the child, get him to ask the questions. In fact, I'm reminded of a Hasidic translation. I think it's from the Sfas Emes, I'm not sure. It says in the Dalet Bonim, it says, Eni yodea lishol at psachlo. Do you remember that? So they all ask the question, why does it say at in the feminine? Why is the teacher, the Av, who's fulfilling his mitzvah vigadita, why is he an at? Why is he a female? And based on the Maralmi Prague, who says that the idea in a conceptual, abstract sense of male and female is male is active and female is the recipient, is the makabel. So vi'at psachlo means you should make yourself into a makabel, which means to draw the answers from the child himself, as if you are receiving from him. That's the ideal method of teaching. Now, if he doesn't have a son, the Rambam goes on to say, let his wife ask the question. And the Rambam goes even a step further. If he doesn't have a wife, he should ask himself the question. That's a pella. It sounds like a schizophrenic. But the answer is that even when one is teaching himself, he should be teaching. And if he asks the question and thinks about the question, the answer that he comes up with will be that much more meaningful, will penetrate into his nefesh. So once again, to summarize the first three halachas in the Rambam, the first halach is focused on the source for the mitzvah of Sipur and the time for the mitzvah of Sipur. Having quoted Vigadita, the Rambam has to dispel a mistake that we might think that this mitzvah is conditional on the fact that he has a son. And then the Rambam in Halacha Beis goes on to define the mitzvah as a mitzvah of Sipur, which applies even to a Chacham, because the mitzvah is not Limud, but Sipur. But the Rambam says that essentially the Torah says to teach us that the Sipur should be B'derech Limud. The methodology should be one of teaching the child, which means that it depends upon the child and his own propensities, and also try to stimulate the curiosity of the child, and there should be a question and answer. Now, let me ask the following question. Does the mitzvah of Sipur, which the Rambam says applies even if he has no son, even if he doesn't have a wife to ask him questions, imagine a person who's sitting by himself on the night of Pesach, does it require amira, speech? He has to enunciate the words, and that's Sipur? Or could it be yotzei b'machshava, with thought alone? And I quote to you a Gemara regarding a summa, a blind person, as to whether or not he could read the Haggadah for the others at the table, and whether or not he's a bar chiyuva, because the Torah says bavur zeh, and he's incapable of saying zeh and pointing to the matzah, etc., etc. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth about this point on Kuf Tezayin. But what is the underlying assumption here? The people at the Seder are being yotzei through what we call Shomer Ka'oneh. And in Mirz Hashem, tomorrow night I have a shir here in Ramat Beit Shemesh. I'm going to be discussing this at great length. But it would seem that there's a halach of Shomer Ka'oneh. Now, Shomer Ka'oneh only applies when there's a mitzvah of kriya. For example, If I read the Torah, you're Yotze by hearing my Kriya. If I read Kriya Shema, you can be Yotze by hearing my Kriya. If I read the Megillah, then you're going to be Yotze by hearing my Kriya through Shomei Ka'ona. And it seems that the Gemara is applying the same mechanics to the Haggadah Shel Pesach. And if the Suma is not Chayav, then there's no Shomei Ka'ona, because the Shomei Ka'ona methodology and mechanics is contingent on the fact that the one who's Mashmiya is obligated in the mitzvah. He's a Bar Chiyuv, and the Gemara goes back and forth as to whether a Suma is Chayav in Vigada to Lebincha Bavur Zeh. However, I want to read to you one line in the Sefer Achinuch, who was one of the Rishonim, in Mitzvah Chaf Aleph. He writes the following: Im ein sham acherim, meaning he's alone at the Seder, chayev lahotzi advar mipiv. So far, so good. I'm very excited about those words, except that he adds the following sentence: lahotzi mipiv, kedei laorer libo b'davar, ki adibur yaorer halev. I'm going to read that again. Listen carefully to the words of the Chinuch. Chayev lahotzi advar mipiv, kedei laorer libo b'davar, ki b'dibur yaorer halev. Now I ask you the following question: what is the mitzvah of sipur? Is it a mitzvah of dibur and kriya, enunciating the words, or is it a mitzvah of machsheves halev? What conclusion do you derive from the chinuch? Again, we're on Zoom, so it's a little complicated. If we're face to face, it would be a lot easier. But if anyone could answer my question by unmuting themselves,
would you not say that that's the best way? The chinuch
right? So
is saying,
again, when I tell you that X is the best way to achieve Y, in the case of the chinuch, dibur is the best method of being ma'orer halev. What is the mitzvah? Is it the dibur?
No, he's not saying that.
He's saying it's the lev. So the dibur, according to the chinuch, is only a method of being ma'orer halev. And he's so much of an advocate that he tells you should be medaber. Don't just think about it. Don't just contemplate the great miracles that took place, transpired at the time Yitzis Mitzrayim. Speak about it, kedei la'or halev. But it's clear to me, at least, from the language of the chinuch, that the mitzvah is basically a mitzvah shebalev. And therefore I wonder, why is it necessary that the person who's reading the Haggadah is obligated in the mitzvah of Haggadah in order for me and my colleagues who's ever at the Seder table to be Yotze through that Kriya? It's not the mitzvah of Dibur, which is contingent, then the key would be contingent on Shomei Ka'ona, but rather mitzvahs b'leiv. And if his reading will be ma'or my leiv, basishlech. I mean, what's bad about that? So honestly, I cannot figure out, if I take this chinuch literally. Again, if he's saying drushes, if he's just he's expounding on the Tamei HaMitzvahs or something like that, that we want to get to be ma'or the leiv, and he's adding that as an add-on, another advantage to dibur. Okay, so that's just a drusha. But here the Sefer Achinuch seems to be defining the mitzvah as a mitzvah shebalev. And not only that, and this again, b'li neder, I want to discuss at great length tomorrow night. I don't know, it's 9 o'clock on our clock, which would probably be 2 p.m. on your clock. I don't know, you're pretty busy at that hour.
It'll be later.
Harvey, not Harvey. I meant to say Joe.
4 o'clock in the morning.
I can't hear you. What?
No, 9 o'clock your time will be 2 o'clock here. 2
That's
p.m.
what I meant to say. What did I say? I meant to say 2 o'clock.
Yeah, 2 p.m.
2 p.m. That's, take a break at 2 p.m.
That's another word, yeah.
You know, the middle matzah is the matzah that we take we break the matzah, right? The yachatz is done in the middle matzah, which is Keneged Yitzchak Avinu.
Yeah.
So I remember I heard once from Rabbi Shapiro down in Florida.
Mordechai or his son?
His son. What's his son's name? Come on, he's
Ephraim Eliyahu.
What?
Ephraim Eliyahu.
Ephraim, yeah. I heard once from Ephraim, he said that when you daven mincha, he gave a few examples, you have to take a break from mincha. Right? Because Yitzchak was Mesake in Tfilas mincha.
Yeah.
And the second matzah, which is Keneged Yitzchak, the middle matzah, is the mitzvah of Yachatz. You know,
Right.
take a break. That's what I used to do when I went to college. So I used to take a break from mincha. I went in those days, probably not today, they had phone booths. And I went into a phone booth. I made a long distance call to daven mincha, if you know what I mean. Anyway, take a break from mincha. So the point that I want to make here is that the Maharal Prague says that the mitzvah of the Gadat Lebincha is a mitzvah Shebelev. And I don't know how to square that with the Gemara about Suma. Okay, I'm just mentioning that question. By the way, if you go through the Rambam carefully, he repeats himself time after time about the Korei Es HaGodah. You get the impression that according to the Rambam, there's one person reading the Haggadah. That's not my minhag. I don't know if it's yours.
No.
And I was wondering why the Rambam, in WhatsApp you have the status. So you have a status called the Korei Haggadah. Well, what's the big status of the Korei? So in Kriyas HaMegillah, I understand that there's a Korei. One should not read the Megillah along with the Korei. One should hear the Korei. There used to be a television program before you were born called Sing Along with Mitch. There's no such thing as sing along with the Korei. You should be listening to the Korei. Okay, if you miss a word, and you have a Megillah, that's something else. But ideally, you should be listening to the Korei. Does anybody know why?
Couldn't the Korei here mean, well, Trei Korei Lo Mishtama?
No, not Trei Kol Mishtama. Trei Kol Mishtama means when I have to listen to two people. But why can't I read it for myself? That's not Trei Kol Mishtama.
Oh, sorry, by the Megillah, you mean?
Yeah, let's say by the Megillah. Why is it incumbent upon me lechatchila, if all is well, that I listen to the Korei as a Megillah?
He's reading a kosher Megillah.
No, let's say I have a Megillah in front of me. That's called Barov Am Hadras Melech. Barov Am Hadras Melech means when you have one Maisa for the entire community. So if you're going to read your own Megillah, because you have a kosher Megillah in front of you, what I call sing along with Mitch, then you forfeit the kiyum of Barov Am Hadras Melech. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. Again, please don't share this with anybody else because I'll be in big trouble. But I think the Rambam holds that Barov Am Hadras Melech applies to the reading of the Haggadah, which means that you shouldn't be reading it yourself. There should be a Korei. Again, you could switch, from one paragraph to the other, give everyone, it could be a rotation. I don't care. It doesn't have to be one Korei from A to Z. But the Rambam over and over again used the word Korei Es Haggadah. And I would say that that's more appropriate for Megillah than for Haggadah Shel Pesach. But perhaps the Rambam holds Barov Am Hadras Melech applies to the Haggadah.
It doesn't just mean out loud.
Yeah, I'm sorry, good, Bobby.
It doesn't just mean out loud.
Yeah, it could be that the Rambam is worried about people who don't know how to read, so read it out loud so others can hear you.
It's more than that. It's Korei. Korei is reading it out loud is a different activity than just reading it to yourself.
Yeah, but the Rambam, for example, has the Kara Munach Bifnei HaKorei. Again, it seems to me that the Rambam is not just giving me a technicality. He's not just giving me a good piece of advice, Eitzah Tova Kamashmalan. I think what the Rambam is saying is that is a kiyum, a tosefes kiyum. I shouldn't use the word tosefes because that refers to tosefes Shabbos. But there's an additional dimension of a kiyum when there's a koreh, whoever that koreh is, because then whenever the mitzvah is shevach, you see, I have a problem. My problem is that in Megillah I understand very well B'rovam Hajus Melech. In fact, Rav Ashi in Masechta Megillah is of the opinion that you could only be Yotzei the mitzvah Megillah b'tzibur. If you read the Megillah without a tzibur, you're not Yotzei. We don't paskin like that. But we definitely paskin that lechatchila you should hear the Megillah b'tzibur. So you come home and you read it for your wife, that's fine if she can't come to hear it b'tzibur. But ideally, you should be listening, and according to one man Omer, this is absolutely critical. B'tzibur. That's Barom V'am Hajus Melech. So you go to the synagogue, and hopefully you have a minyan, and you read the Megillah. That's Barom V'am Hajus Melech. But yet certain mitzvahs, which also require what's called publicity in Lashon HaShas, farhesio, a pirsum, and they only apply in the bayis. For example, the Brisa says regarding Chanukah Ner Ish, what's the next word, everybody?
Basically.
Ubeso. It's gather together the troops in your house and do a Persuve Nisan in your own home. Or, for example, let's take reading the Haggadah. Gather together your family and read the Haggadah. So there seems to be a Barov Hamajus Melech even in the bayis. Bishleim, I understand if you're going to shul and there's going to be a tzibur and a minyan and so forth, that's ein farhes yelav ifnei asara, and now I understand Barov Ham, and that's what happens with Megillah. But where's the Barov Hamajus Melech in Ner Chanukah or in Kriyas Haggadah in the bayis? It's very interesting. There's some mitzvahs require a tzibur for farhesia to be mafarsem the nes persume nisa, like Megillah, and others have persume nisa without a gathering of a minyan at tzibur, just in the bayis. In fact, the Yushalmi says about I think it was Bar Kapara, the Hagos Maimonides quotes this Yushalmi at the very beginning of Hilchas Megillah, that Bar Kapara, who was a Tana, would gather his family together to read the Megillah in front of them. Because in the Megillah it says, Mishpacha, Mishpacha. So it seems like there is a concept of Barov Am, of Pirsum, even within a family unit in a bayis, which is true with regard to Ner Chanukah, and I'm wondering if it might be true with regard to Haggadah. And therefore the Koreh is, so to speak, gathering together the members of his household to read the Haggadah. Yeah, David.
I have an alternate explanation, so maybe what you're saying is not necessarily the only pshat. And that is, you're with Haggadah and Sipur both the night of Pesach, right? The question,
David, you have to raise your voice and drop and speak slowly. I'm sorry, because it's a Zoom limitation.
Okay, so I'm going to say it like this. It's lav dafka pirsum anything. It's a mitzvah of Haggadah, which is two things. Haggadah and Sipur, which are not the same thing. Haggadah means, it's like Haggadah Sedus. You're actually saying something that's new to a beis din. So the act of Haggadah is what you're doing, and that's why you need an audience. And reading to yourself isn't good enough. It's not necessarily pirsum these. It could be that too, but saying there's another possibility here. And Sipur means telling your family the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is an old story, but you have to add stuff to it. That's a Haggadah portion. So it's not necessarily pirsum these necessarily. It's the act of Haggadah Sedus, basically.
Interesting. Fascinating. I'm a Kabbalist, so I like it.
Okay.
I have to think about it, but I like it. And maybe we could apply the same definition to Chanukah, that maybe Chanukah is also an Eidus. After all, the military battle against the Greeks was Ki'ilu al Piderech HaTeva, or one could have said so. And therefore, you have to gather together your family to testify that this was Yad Hashem, that this was Nisim and Inflows.
Right. Yeah, right. But the thing is,
Okay.
like, the Gemara says that even if you're alone, you're still going to ask the 4 questions and so on, right?
Right.
And the reason why is because that's the Sipur or Haggadah portion. It requires an act of speaking.
Right.
It's not enough just to read it with your eyes only.
I know we're running out of time. Let me just try to add in the next 5 minutes 2 more points. In the Haggadah, it says, Omer Abelazar ben Azariah, Harani kiven shivim shana lo zachisi sheti Omer Yitzias Mitzrayim ba'leilos. So there's a whole discussion here between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Ben Zoma about whether or not this mitzvah applies b'layla. What mitzvah is this paragraph addressing?
Remember, she was rhyme.
Right, this is a mitzvah that applies the whole year round. And I was wondering, why did the Baal HaGodah introduce this machlokas, this controversy about whether the mitzvah of Laman Tizkar, as Yom Tzeischam Eretz Mitzrayim Kol Yimei Chayecha Kol comes to be marble leilos, or not? There's only a mitzvah during the day, which is machlokas tanoim. But Zechira is one mitzvah, and Sipur is a different mitzvah. For example, in Zechira, we don't find Kol Marble L'Sap Erez and Meshuba. Zechira means just Zechira Koldu. But I was thinking out loud that maybe the Baal HaGodah wants to tell you how important Yetzias Mitzrayim is. It's so important that there's a mitzvah of remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim the whole year round, and maybe even twice a day. Kolshkein, on the night of Yetzias Mitzrayim, how important it is to be misaper b'Yetzias Mitzrayim. And one last point before we go. Chachamim omrim yemei chayecha ha'olam hazeh, kol yemei chayecha lahavi limos haMashiach. Now, the Baal HaGodah, the name of the Chachamim against the Shita Ben Zoma, is trying to darshan and derive, why does the Torah say kol yemei chayecha? Ben Zoma assumes it means even leilos. The Chachamim want to say no. Kol yemei chayecha comes as a ribui for Yemos HaMashiach. So I want to ask 2 questions, and with that I'll end. And I hope, Joe, this is what you meant at the end of last issue when you said I should talk about Pesach. I don't know, you didn't give me too much of an insight, and I don't seem to find your WhatsApp number, so if you could send me a WhatsApp, I would really appreciate it. Question number 1, Yemos HaMashiach. I mean, we don't know that mitzvahs don't apply to Yemos HaMashiach. I mean, should we go through all 613 mitzvahs and find a ribui for Yemos HaMashiach? And question number 2, why does it say lahavi limos HaMashiach? Classic kol, the word kol in the Torah, is larabos. I would have written the text as kol yemei chayecha larabos limos HaMashiach. What's lahavi limos HaMashiach? And very quickly, because this is a half hour's discussion, which we don't have time for, I want to mention to you something I heard from Rab Shneur Kotler, Zichrono Livracha, Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood. He said, and he had many proofs for this, that li'asid lavo, at the time of Mashiach, the mitzvah will no longer be Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim alone, meaning that alone, but rather the mitzvah will be an expanded mitzvah. And it would include all of the Geula, the ultimate Geula, at the time of Mashiach, which we so desperately need now, will have Nisim and Iflos that will dwarf and overshadow the Nisim of Yetzias Mitzrayim. It gets hard for us to comprehend that, but there are many, many proofs for that. And therefore, what the Baal HaGodah is pointing out in the name of the Chachamim is that the Ribui of Kol is coming to tell us that Yetzias Mitzrayim is only a part of the picture. The totality of the picture is Geula, and the mitzvah is to remember the Geula. And lahavi limos HaMashiach, not lerabos. Rabos usually means a tofel. I'll give you another ribui. to include something else. You have an Isra Hana, you have an Isra Achila, and then you have even an Isra Hana. L'rabos. No. This is lahavi. Lahavi means to achieve the ultimate of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. And that is the Yemos HaMashiach. Because the mitzvah is not Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, but Sipur HaGeula. Right now, the only Geula we have is Mitzrayim. But ultimately, the ultimate Geula will be B'Yemos HaMashiach, and that's lahavi. That will be a brand new mitzvah. Not totally new, because it's still part of the mitzvah of Geula, but it will include not just Mitzrayim, but even greater miracles at the time of Mashiach. So I want to wish you all a great Chag HaPesach. By next Wednesday, I'll be deep in the Chametz, if you know what I mean. So we'll pick it up later after the Chag, and we should be zoche to see Lahavi Limos HaMashiach. In Lubavitch, they sing, "We want Mashiach now." And I would just change it a little bit and say, we need Mashiach now. And we need it desperately. And I don't know what Hamas is doing in your part of the world, in Toronto. Plenty of Hamasnikim. But I think I mentioned to you once that I have a friend who's a professor at the University MIT in Massachusetts, a very frume Yid. And he tells me that the Asians at MIT are wearing keffiyas and demonstrating with Hamas, and he adds the following sentence: they don't even know where Israel is on the map, and they certainly don't know where Gaza is on the map. But they are protesting to bring down the state of Israel. So I don't know how safe it is anywhere in the world. Mirz Hashem, we should be zoche lahavi Limos HaMashiach b'mheira v'yameinu. Amen.
Amen.
Chag kosher v'sameach.
Chag kosher v'sameach.